Welcome back to Criminological Theory. In this chapter topic, we're going to look at social process and learning theories of crime. But the learning theories, what we're going to see here is it's mostly focused on a process of socialization. So we're still in sociological theory, but we're going to explore three very specific theories as you see here. So as you're getting ready to take notes, one of the first things you're going to obviously take notes on is differential association. But differential association was started by Edwin Sutherland. And it was this idea that we had to stop looking, in essence, at criminal behavior as something as being abnormal. It required us to look at how human beings learn to develop behaviors in human life. Every human being goes through stages in life in which they are influenced by others. And from those influences, what you find through these influences and these social interactions, you learn what it means to be a member of a society or to be human, basically. So Edward Sutherland argued, in essence, that criminal behavior is something that you can be taught, that there is no reason why, in essence, certain people are criminals just because they match a description or whatever. It's who is teaching them, right? That it's what they're seeing, what they're reading, and what they're watching that can turn them into a criminal. It was also an idea of looking at classical conditioning. So Edwin Sutherland also looked at some aspects related to Pavlov's research or the Pavlovian theory on dogs, which if you don't know what that is, basically Pavlov would ring a bell to see if dogs would salivate and how well they could that would have a connection to them knowing that had a connection to obviously dinner time or feeding time, and whether they could be conditioned to behave in a certain way with the expectation as well with food. We also know that through classical conditioning that we can stimulate people to respond a certain way. So, for example, the movie A Clockwork Orange looks at that, where there is basically a torture scene where the person's eyes are kept open and they have to watch a film in order to, basically engage in the behavior that the person is expecting, right? So, whether it's that or drug usage, what we try to do, even with drug addiction now, although there has been some controversy around drug addiction treatments, we try to encourage the person to change reaction to stimuli and the response to it. So, for example, if you're an alcoholic, Alcoholics Anonymous will often encourage complete abstinence from alcohol, which would encourage not just you don't drink it, but you're not around alcohol or anyone who could be engaging in drinking alcohol. Or if you're an individual who finds it hard to avoid the substances, maybe replacing one substance with another. For example, some opioid clinics will often give a person a substance that they could take to help them with withdrawal. Oh, and there are other clinics that will give for other substances, marijuana, for example. Well, we know that through classical conditioning, some people can be stimulated to respond a certain way. Differential identification was through Glaser, and this was the idea of how you identify with reference groups. And it didn't require it to be a person who was in your life. It's anyone that you look up to. So the example that I often give in my undergraduate classes is people who like superheroes. But you can use movie stars, sports heroes, any other celebrity. Why do they become important to a person? For example, individuals who start wearing the same clothes as their favorite celebrity, have the same hairstyle, they talk the same way, eat the food that that person eats, because we know way too much about celebrities. Or a person, for example, who looks at like a superhero, fictitious superhero like Batman or Superman, where you see a difference in opinion on not only basic human behavior, but as well how we respond to even bad human behavior like crime, or one is more of a vigilante and the other believes in, you know, even with all of their powers, using as little physical violence as possible to try and get people to turn towards truth, justice, and the American way, as Superman once stated. This idea of how do you understand society around you and why is that important? And what Glazer stated was that if you identify with a person, including a person who is engaged in bad behavior, you could yourself then engage in that same bad behavior, which would include crime. This would explain, for example, why we have copycats when serious crimes occur. That's one possible explanation for them. Differential reinforcement looked at it by this idea of people being born as a blank slate. So this goes back to the classical school. Now you should notice that in each of these theories, there's some interplay with all of the different schools. We don't just necessarily in criminology negate one school versus the other. Well, I do encourage you, like I stated in the first lectures, to really start coming up with your idea of what type of criminologist you think you are and what school really speaks to you. We do have an interplay amongst them. And if you remember this idea of basically rational choice and even free will, well, differential reinforcement brings that back around. But what it changes is that human beings are born as a blank slate who could be taught. We include this even in the modern day with like understandings around racism. We do genuinely believe in science and even in sociology that human beings are not born inherently racist, that in essence it's taught to you. Or it could be through experiences that you have where you have a negative reaction to an individual, and that becomes your basically prejudice towards other people of that same group. Well, differential reinforcement says the same thing happens with crime. In essence, people teach you through conditioning how to become a criminal. So Burgess and Akers kind of looked at Sutherland's framework and said, there's one other thing you need to look at, which is imitation. And Skinner also took a look at operant conditioning. So all of these individuals actually work amongst each other. And what you find there with this conditioning is reinforcement and punishment and imitation. If human beings imitate other people, they're often imitating the other people, not just because of the importance of them in their life, but also, too, because they're getting some type of reinforcement or reward for it. As a small child in a preschool, for example, your teachers would praise you oftentimes if you shared your toys, or if you were like a child who hit another child, you stopped hitting other children, right? Or the children who cried, oftentimes it was stated in parental theories that you should just let the child cry out whatever they're upset about. We know that human beings do like a reward punishment structure. We saw this with the classical school. Bandura also took the imitation idea that was being looked at and said, well, that's modeling. So he actually created a doll study and had children basically, while he observed them, take care of this doll. And he watched to see how the children took care of these dolls. And what he often found was the way that they took care of the dolls often matched up with the way their parents took care of them. So he pointed to that and said, basically, if a child, for example, is a victim of abuse, they're more likely to become an abusive child or person towards their doll because that is what they've been taught to mimic and model as the correct behavior. So if we're able to break people of negative behaviors, we can obviously fix that problematic issue. Sykes and Matza build into this idea of neutralization, that people not only learn and that influences their behavior, but it's what happens when you basically move into criminality and justify it. See, whenever you commit a crime, there's always going to be a victim. And The problem is, who is the victim and how do you understand the impact of what happened? The criminal in and of himself can be a victim, according to Sykes and Matza, because they will suffer a repercussion for their actions. And if they continue to rationalize and justify the behavior and continue to engage in it despite negative repercussion, we call that neutralization. If they continue to engage and justify the criminal offending, even when their victims confront them and tell them what the impact of being a crime victim did to them, then that's neutralization. Basically, what they argue is most human beings, once confronted with the reality of the situation and the repercussions of their actions, will either stop engaging in the behavior or attempt to justify and rationalize it. And it's particularly true with youthful individuals. So there's a uniform 5 techniques of neutralization. You see them here on the slide. And what it builds into is that what you create is endless excuses. You are not going to, in essence, state that you did something wrong, that you were harmed in some measure by this situation, and that you can't be held accountable. We often see this, the most severe forms of this, in criminal behavior among psychopaths. Psychopathy is often present with techniques of neutralization, where they will justify their actions and state that they didn't do anything wrong. This can also come up in social situations, in relationships, where individuals have narcissistic personality disorder and they can harm other people in their lives. In control theories, we basically looked at an assumption around, do people naturally commit a crime if there's no restraining factor in play? So what are the reasons why people don't engage in criminal activity? The early ones, Durkheim comes back around, looked at Hobbes, and then Freud. We also looked at Rees and Tooby, and then Nye. I apologize. For some reason, in this lecture, I thought I put the slides on there, but I did not. So let's go back. Hobbes particularly looked at it in a connection to that, again, that social contract. If we as a society come to agree that human beings were in some measure connected to each other, and that they were going to agree to abide by this unofficial contract, then individuals who don't abide by the social contract would in some measure be punished for it. All right. The Durkheim looked at this idea building out of the social contract as this idea of individuals who have, on some measure, a collective consciousness, that society in and of itself creates this idea of oneself, right? And from this idea of collective consciousness, you have the ability to reflect on your actions, and you're able to, in some measure, determine the correct thing versus the right thing by what the rest of society tells you is good versus wrong, right? Freud built it out from extensions of his psychoanalytic theory, and he argued basically that human beings have 3 aspects of their personality, and each of us are competing interests between the id, the ego, and the superego. For the id, that in and of itself is something where you are looking at the basis of sexual and aggressive energy, and it's basically unconscious, and it creates some illogical wishful thinking. The ego is tasked with balancing reality with the demands of desire, the id, so a lot of it is sexual or aggressive based. and then morality, which is found in the superego. And the superego is your conscious. So your identification with the social groups, even your parents, it tells you what is right versus wrong. So basically, the id and the superego are competing amongst each other, and they need to be balanced out by the ego. Rice looked at it as the same extension of Freud's idea of the ego and the superego, and basically argued that it was a consequence of one of them being weak. Toby looked at, as we state here, was you actually have a responsibility as a human being to conform on some measure. And when you don't conform, what happens is you're going to lose your place in society. And your response to losing that place will also measure out your stake in conformity. And then Nye talked about the ideas of control. And particularly what we see here is the issue's difference between internal, direct, and indirect. Internal can be also kind of equated to what we saw there with this idea of a conscious. How do you yourself regulate your behavior so you don't engage in things like crime, right? You are internally controlled. The direct control is what we can put on you in terms of this idea of things like, particularly the police or prison. And the indirect control, on some measure, is basically some different measure to, your creation of basically how you're interact. The best way to state it, honestly, is the interaction within society and how you are particularly balancing out these other things, such as, for example, the church, the school, or other social interactions. As a matter of fact, one of the best way it was ever explained to me, let me actually break it down this way. It depends upon your connection to your caretakers. If you're not connected to caregivers or to places like, for example, a church, or another environment, you're going to have some problem with components of control. Reckless took all of these into play and said there is some type of containment going on in the play, building out about these factors, right? So with the inner containment, there's this idea of both internal and external controls, again, going back to social interaction for internal development of a consciousness, and external, which is obviously the constraints we put on people, to are you able to push or pull yourself away from antisocial behavior? With outer containment, obviously there are some aspects where we can stop you from doing it, right? Like, again, going back to the police, to the church, all those different things. So then what comes into play is what is pushing and pulling you into criminal behavior or antisocial behavior. So the social environment, lack of opportunities, or even risk-taking personalities and who you hang out with. It could include, for example, watching too much violence, or it could include your inability to resist temptation, or internalizing bad social norms, or some other factor that keeps you from engaging in antisocial behavior. To the point that many of you have probably heard of drift theory, which also build out again. This is a continuing picture. Each of these aspects build on one another to what happens when social controls are weakened. And basically, Max has stated that there is some measure of what we call self-determinism, that some people, unfortunately, will get involved in criminality, even though they probably wouldn't have gotten involved in it in any other measure. And it's mostly because social controls broke down. So it starts in your juvenile aspects. So that's why we focus on delinquency and not. And then it only continues to build once strong controls like constant supervision or obligations and responsibilities are decreased. And then when you're not monitored or supervised, you will then experiment with risky behavior and then attempt to rationalize it. It's no different than when your parents say to you, if your friends get involved in some risky behavior, would you do it as well? There's a reason why parents will ask that question, seeing how the aspect of social control impacts you. Hershey's social bond theory really kind of looked at this same aspect of the social control, but what is your connection to these different bonds? So with these four elements, you need to have some measure of, in essence, a strong connection, a strong social bond to the rest of society, or the argument is you will devolve into criminal behavior, antisocial behavior. Think of it like a child in school. If they're engaged in after school activities, first we want them to be attached to the people who they are playing with, like their teammates, to their coach, to this idea of playing sports, then be committed to their teammates and to their coach and to the team, staying heavily involved by going to every practice and going to every game and playing well, and believing that the team is one of the strongest factors for success, not just the individual, and that they can perform well and that it's worth doing it. That's no different than your attachment to the rest of society, your commitment in upholding the law, your involvement with social groups to encourage other people to uphold the law and to stay connected, in your belief in this idea that crime is a behavior you shouldn't engage in. So eventually, all these theories were put together in what we call integrated control. That in essence, both Gottfriedson and Hershey, so Hershey came back around with another theorist and said, looking at children, the control is established when you're being raised, fully develops by age 10, and when a child has low self-control, they have trouble basically balancing out on some measure correct behavior versus wrong behavior. Or in the example of Till, this idea of how you balance control versus the control you're subjected to and one you can exercise. So like every other chapter, because it's criminological theory, we leave off with policy implications. So the biggest one was learning. As you can see here, we need to create opportunities for growth, and particularly to, when we talk about positive reinforcement, reinforcing the behaviors we want, and negative reinforcement, stating the behaviors we don't want. To ensure people don't learn from criminal behavior, to retrain their brains cognitively to stay away from risky behavior, and to ensure that parents and children and the rest of society stay bonded to one another and committed. I hope this was beneficial for you, and I thank you for your time.